Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now on our 18th episode of 2022. But before we kick off, I'd like to thank our sponsors of Fiber for Breakfast. That includes our gold sponsors of CHR Solutions, Millennium, and Plume, and our silver sponsor, Graybar. We are now 9 days away from the NTI issuing the $42.45 billion BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity, aka the NOFO. Yesterday, Andy Burke from NTIA said that the NOFO will be released on May 13th, a week from this Friday, versus May 16th. So it's great to hear that NTI is slightly ahead of schedule. Also looks like they don't like working weekends, so that's great for us. So we're going to get this on probably at midnight on Friday night and spend our weekend scrubbing through. So Fiber Connect 2022 is now less than 6 weeks away and will be held in Nashville, June 12th to 15th. And man, is it gone crazy. The Gaylord is about sold out. So I just contracted the inn at the Gaylord as their overflow hotel. So hopefully that's not too long a walk across the parking lot. So if you haven't registered or booked your hotel, please do so ASAP because our event will be sold out. And we apologize, there's over 60 companies waiting on our waiting list exhibit. We just have already, capped out all our exhibitors. And so we are locked and loaded. It's going to be awesome. Yesterday, the FCC announced another $200 million in RDOF awards approvals. That brings us over to $5.2 billion for broadband deployment to 3 million locations in 47 states out of the $9.3 billion awarded in the RDOF auction 18 months ago. While it's taken a year longer than anybody ever expected, the good news is that the FCC has not approved the long forms for the Starlink low Earth orbit satellite service. That is a huge victory for the 640,000 homes that were at risk of being relegated to the wrong side of the digital divide for years to come. I just hope these rural families are not redlined from the $42.5 billion BEAD funding for literally having Starlink hanging over their heads. So speaking of unlocking funding, today's Fiber for Breakfast session will be focused on robust mapping and public-private partnerships unlocking rapid broadband funding deployment in Georgia. But before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast sponsors, gold sponsors, CHR Solutions, Millennium and Plume, and silver sponsor, Graybar. Now, if everyone would just keep in mind that you're all in listen mode only. To ask a question, just type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. Gary will host a Q&A session at the end with our panelists. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. Please take a minute to do so. We truly appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week at Fiber for Breakfast, we spoke with my good friend Jeff Hainan on his latest research on spending on fiber to the home and what technologies are going to be used over the next 5 years. We learned that 10 gig symmetric fiber to the home is what most providers are and will be deploying, and XGS-PON, that 10 gig symmetric technology, is the winning technology. We also heard that DOCSIS 4.0 will continue to be a science project as cable companies are beginning to move more aggressively to fiber to the home. This morning, we have the pleasure to speak with Josh Hildebrandt, the Director of Broadband Initiatives at Georgia Technology Authority. Josh will be discussing how robust mapping and public-private partnerships unlocking rapid broadband funding deployment in Georgia. Josh Hildebrandt serves as the Director of Broadband Initiatives at the Georgia Technology Authority, focusing solely on Georgia's broadband deployment strategy and connectivity funding mechanisms and supporting local communities and providers in their expansion efforts. Before starting at GTA, Josh worked at Georgia Department of Natural Resources, where he oversaw the agency's legislative and policy efforts, communications, and external affairs. Prior to joining DNR, Josh served in Governor Brian Kemp's administration as the policy advisor for rural initiatives, including ag, natural resources, and technology. Josh is a graduate of Belmont in Nashville. I always think of Belmont as like Brad Paisley and Leon Warmack, and like, can you sing, Josh?
I can't at least not too well. I think we all can, but it's yeah, definitely they are some of the shining stars that have come out of Belmont.
Oh, good. All right. Well, welcome, Josh, and for our audience, please type in your questions in our Q&A section as we go. And with that, over to Josh.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you so much to FBA. It is my pleasure to be joining y'all today from the Peach State. It is a warm one down here, so it's not the worst thing being inside right now. The last couple of days have definitely been up there, as I think Gary can appreciate that, just being a state over from us. But it is, while things are hot here, weather-wise, things are also hot in Georgia on the broadband front and on the deployment front. So my pleasure to be with y'all today and talking about what we've got going on, a couple of the different angles that that we see in Georgia, and talking about some of our policy and strategies around deploying these funds. So glad to be with y'all today. So something to keep in mind about what we've got in Georgia is that, we're still we do have a state broadband office, still relatively new. It was established in 2018 with the founding legislation that came out of our General Assembly. And it's actually a joint office between the Department of Community Affairs, which focuses a lot on community engagement, talking with communities, and then also they run a lot of the state's grant program. That's important to remember, the state's grant program, not necessarily the federal. And so, and then on the Georgia technology front, this is the state's IT solutions and IT strategy arm of the executive branch underneath Governor Brian Kemp. And we focus currently a lot more on evaluation of projects, engineering, general policy, keeping track of the different federal initiatives and federal programs, and overall much more focused on strategy, data, and policy. So, through our coordination efforts with DCA and a couple other state agencies here in Georgia, we are a fairly small office with myself, one other full-time employee, which is our deputy CIO for broadband and special projects, Jessica Simmons. And then there's also a team member over at DCA currently focusing on one of the programs we'll talk about here shortly. But while we're small, does not mean that we're necessarily inactive or that we have a problem moving quickly. Georgia's fortunate not to have our state agencies siloed too much. We do work very, very well together, whether that's our Department of Transportation, our PSC, our Governor's Office of Planning and Budget that focuses a lot on grant efforts and financing and things like that. So we have a lot of folks that are invested and are really part of the broadband team here in Georgia, even if they're not officially part of the broadband office. And, as you can see down there, a couple of the different efforts on this slide that we've done. We helped with student connectivity and highlighting districts that had big connectivity gaps during the pandemic when remote learning increased. We work with our Department of Public Health on telehealth opportunities. But, of what is the most exciting, I think, to this group of folks and to, seeing what we've got going on in Georgia is our annual reporting that we do each year that comes out at the end of the year, showing, how we've improved and some of the different major initiatives that the state has undergone. And then most excitedly, our broadband availability map, which is one of the few location level maps, and I think one of the very few location level maps that actually has where you can actually see from the public side of things, where service lacks in certain communities. And that has really helped Georgia be able to move forward very quickly, as you will see here, in deploying some of these different federal funds, and then primed to deploy a couple of state funds as well, as I'll talk about a little bit later. So as I mentioned about our broadband map, which we're very proud of here in Georgia, just a little bit of something that we like to share. As we're all waiting on the FCC to unveil their new mapping efforts towards the end of the year or early part of next year, back when they were first establishing and standing up, what they wanted it to look like, they contacted actually our mapping vendor and our mapping folks and team here in Georgia to ask how we accomplish what we have done here with this map. So certainly, when you've got the federal government reaching out to you to ask you how you've done what you've done at the state level, that tells you a little bit about how great of a product you have and how helpful it can be. But what you can see here is the dark gold color are served locations or served census blocks in Georgia, the lighter yellow or unserved, and then where you've got the gray, no locations. And you might be asking, how do you have so many areas that have no locations? Well, that's the swamp, that's salt marsh out on the coast, and then military bases where they focus on their own efforts, and the state is not involved. And so, with this, as you can see there, the definition in Georgia is for a location to be deemed served, it has to have at least 25.3 terrestrial service. So we do not count, speaking to Gary's comment about Starlink and SpaceX, we do not count that as eligible service here in Georgia. We ask that everything is terrestrial, so we do not count satellite, or else probably the entire state would be served, and that would not be accurate. And so, what's really makes our map different and exciting is what you see on the right-hand side of this screen, which we call our red dot map. Those are actually unserved, plottable, lat-long address locations, physical addresses in our state that you can actually scroll down to and get pretty close to all the way down to ground level. We do blot it out right at the end just for privacy purposes. But for the most part, I mean, you can see, if you are, overlaying a map on this, you can, where those roads are, where these locations are, and you can very easily see, which locations we deem as being unserved. And that is fantastic for planning purposes. That's really helped our providers in Georgia and our communities to be as detailed as they can in their efforts. And that really helped us deploy ARPA funds very quickly, as I'll mention here in a minute, because we were able to really say, hey, these are the locations, and people could get really accurate with the way that they drew their projects and their shape files to really go after those unserved. When I think in a lot of other cases beforehand, both in Georgia and other states, it wasn't nearly so accurate. And you don't know if you were going after served or unserved locations. You were kind of guessing to that degree. And then one last thing that makes our mapping different, especially from the federal level, are for a census block to be deemed served, instead of one location or just a handful of locations having service and then being able to be deemed served, 80% of those locations in that census block have to have service in order to be deemed a served census block. And you can see here where this mapping is so helpful, because you will see red dots in those served locations. That's what makes this so special, is that even in a served census block at 80%, we know there's still unserved locations in there, and we actually plot those so they don't get left behind. As Gary was mentioning about redlining, of just being like, if you're in a served census block and you don't have service, good luck. It's going to be hard for you to get service, or it has been historically. And we found a way to get around that in Georgia. We can go on to the next slide. Another big focus that we have in Georgia is a focus on our communities. Something that we heard as to a barrier historically with deploying broadband, especially in rural parts of the state, were a breakdown in communication between our providers and our communities. In areas that providers, were not used to working with, in areas that municipalities or counties and their elected officials weren't used to engaging with telecom groups and especially broadband providers. And so it was just, it was a situation where oftentimes permitting would be very cumbersome. It would take a long time. Permitting fees might be vastly increased because a community would have to bring in someone who could evaluate those because their current planners were not used to evaluating broadband projects. And certainly a lot of them, as I think we can all see around the country, of just kind of still how areas and communities were still somewhat divided on the public's role on broadband expansion and deployment before the pandemic. Not a lot of communities had broadband in their long-term plans like they did road projects or water and sewer projects. And so we created a broadband ready designation that providers can go online and see these counties and cities that have said, hey, we've jumped through these hoops, we've done these certain things that show that we're ready to engage with you. We're ready to do work with our providers and to bring service to our constituents in our areas by adding broadband to their comprehensive plans and adopting model ordinances that the provider community actually helped the state come up with as to something that would be very friendly to them in certain areas. That might be having a more expedited permitting process, having a direct that a city or a county has to have a specific public contact for providers to reach out to about permitting, because that's also something that had been a problem in getting in touch with the right person. And so this has really helped us. And you can see all of these communities that have become broadband ready. That's basically only in a year. This program was stood up towards the end of 2020. So all of these, as of the end of last year, have already jumped on board, and we've got more coming on board and online more often, even these days. We can go on to the next slide, please. So in recent broadband developments in Georgia, we're very excited. I talked about a very expeditious process here in Georgia, and that we're moving at, as some people might appreciate today, being May the 4th, we are moving at light speed here in Georgia. We might not be the Millennium Falcon, but we might be something that's a little bit slower than that. But we're trying to follow in the draft of them through this for our Star Wars fans out there. And Georgia was a big winner of RDOF back about 18 months ago. You can see that on the right-hand side with that map. Those are all different colors that show the different providers, but where there was a color, that is a census block that was awarded in Georgia. And so about 326 million was awarded to be authorized to 15 providers serving about 179,000 locations in Georgia. With 9% of Georgia being unserved with about 482,000 locations. That's important to know. We're talking about locations, not individuals. So we do show a large amount of locations in Georgia that are unserved versus FCC mapping. But that is that's certainly getting us a long way with RDOF. And then Governor Kemp made the decision to utilize state fiscal recovery funds under ARPA for broadband deployment, and we were one of the earliest states to deploy those funds, again, due to the state of where we were in Georgia. So 408 million announced on February 1st, addressing 70 counties, and you can see the locations there, about a little over 130,000 locations being unserved. And just really quick, so that when you are looking at this map further down the road, what we have plotted here is the dark yellow or the served census blocks. The green is the overlay of the RDOF locations, and then the red were the ARPA locations. So you can see there just how far we've gotten just with these two funds, and we're well positioned for the future. And speaking of the future and what we have going on, let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, this is a joint effort here in Georgia. We've got a lot of different offices involved. But I want y'all to know that, that might be code language for bureaucracy. That is not the case here in Georgia. If you are wanting to talk about what the state's doing on broadband expansion and different policies and strategies, you're talking to the right person. You're seeing the right person right now. I'm one of two with Jessica Simmons. And so by getting in touch with us, we'll be able to walk you through what's going on in Georgia and to hold your hand and to help you do business here, or at least to get a lay of the land in Georgia, and talking about what we anticipate with some future funding coming on. So the state currently has about 25 million to deploy through a state program. We're working on how we are going to do that. Again, with all these federal funds coming down and some of those tight timelines, we have kind of adjusted our focus to the federal programs, but we do still have some state dollars that we could deploy this year. We do anticipate that Georgia will get just under 260 million in capital projects fund. Governor Kemp and his administration have mentioned that they, it hasn't been finalized, but they want to spend as many of those funds on connectivity, whether that's a little bit on devices, a little bit on middle mile. We have to get our plan approved by the by Treasury, as everyone else does right now. But a large amount of that 260 will be a grant, will most likely be a grant program for last mile, similar to the ARPA process that we just did this last summer, or this last fall. And then lastly, Georgia is well positioned because of our location level map to challenge and to make sure that the FCC's map is as accurate as possible. So because of that, we should not be sitting on our hands for too long once that map is deployed. So hopefully here in Georgia, we view that we will be able to put together our plan and finalize whatever is our final allocation from NTIA as soon as possible. And we will be moving quickly, whether that's Q1 or Q2 next year. We will not be waiting. We'll be moving quickly on that. So potentially within the next year, the state will be standing up a state program, a capital projects program, and hopefully a BEAD program as well by sometime next summer. So that is a lot of funding with a lot of programs, and you can see that Georgia's not waiting. And I hope people take that to heart, that we are moving quickly here in Georgia. And I believe that's it. That's my information. So if I can be of any help, please do not be a stranger. And I'll kick it back here to Gary now.
Well, great stuff, Josh. Jennifer or Trish, whoever's doing the slides, can you pull back up to the one of the beginning slides? I'll tell you which one real quick. That one, go back one. All right, so just want to, I think we talked a little bit about this, but you have, so over 9% of locations are unserved, 25.3, so 482,000 locations. And so when I look at the FCC 477, that comes in at 654,000, and then when you look at Broadband Now, that's 1.85 million. And so help everybody understand what that number really means. And
yeah, so with this, again, we were talking about locations. I think with some of these other research projects, they're talking about individuals. Here in Georgia, again, because it is location level, we focus on a location. So to a degree, we view a household that has 6 people in it to a household that has 1 person in it as equal. And one can take what the most recent census data shows as what's a typical household in Georgia. It's about 2.7 individuals in there, and you multiply that by these locations, and you can see we quickly get north of the FCC number. I am interested in seeing what Broadband Now, and I've actually reached out to them in their research, what they've done, because their number is a little bit higher, but makes me think of if that brings in some multi-dwelling units or some public housing a little bit more, where here in Georgia, and I have a feeling that is a lot of what they've brought in, we have this really is a rural problem in Georgia. 9 out of every 10 unserved locations are rural. And so with a lot of your public housing in urban areas, they appear as served, but they are certainly not served when it comes to the people component of either adoption or utilization, or how to properly have reliable service. So I do think there's a bigger problem here, but when looking at simply served and unserved at the location, that's how we look at our numbers.
Yeah, and so just for the audience, so if I do multiply that number by 2.7, so it's roughly somewhere 1.5 million people. So it's closer to the broadband now and probably twice as much as what the FCC 477 reports.
Exactly.
So that's kind of consistent that, most everybody is more leaning to the broadband now number than what the FCC has done. Well, great stuff. One of the other questions, you had put, so your office, which is great because, when listening to like Joey Wendler at Treasury or Alan Davidson at NTIA or, the guys at the FCC, and even RUS, it's very complex on what money you can deploy for what. And so like, for instance, Treasury is much more flexible on overbuilding, what I call overbuilding, which is an impossible hamstring term, right? Because if you're trying to reach unserved people, and to do that, you have to pass served people, you can't really, if an incumbent provider says, hey, I'm not gonna go serve your community, and the community provider goes and tries to serve the community, but they're saying, oh, you can't use this money to serve anybody that's profitable, that really, so it looks like that you guys could help provide our service providers use the strategy on what you should use RUS, what you should use capital projects, what you should use for RDOF, so trying to find the right money for the right locations.
And that's absolutely right, Gary. With our state fiscal recovery funds that we did, the $408 million, we actually did not have an overbill threshold. I think that will, scare a lot of people, but we let it be organic because Treasury didn't have an overbill threshold that they had in their interim final rule or final rule. And in the end, we had just a little over 25% overbilled from talking with providers. In most of those cases, we're not talking about overbuilding, gig networks or overbuilding fiber networks. In most of those cases, it was overbuilding copper that was deemed as having, 25.3, which, might be a little bit generous to view that as hitting 25.3, but turning legacy technologies like copper into fiber. So, we really do view that all of those locations were at least, getting locations either 25.3 or to 120 if they happen to have a little bit more of that. But, this really does help with that, as you mentioned, Gary, of saying, hey, we can look at your plans when someone submits a grant or an engineering plan and say, hey, we understand that your application shows 12% overbuild, but it's because you're having to run past all of these to get to these communities that are unserved. And if you knocked out all of those currently served locations, then you might be asking for twice as much money. And so, we want to be reasonable as much as NTIA is going to allow us. We have a feeling that upon the release of the NOFO, we'll see that they're going to be much more strict on the overbuild component. And again, that's where our mapping is going to be really, really helpful because it allows people to really carve around and get to those unserved locations only.
Well, fantastic. So, one of the questions says that, Georgia has done some amazing work on mapping, leading the nation. So thanks for sharing the best practices. So the question is, many states have moved to define broadband in more modern bandwidth needs, of greater than 25.3. Do you foresee Georgia modernizing their definition of broadband? And just a caveat on that is, I was with Chad Roop last week in Montana, and their state had defined, did a grant for 25.5, right, for some crazy reason. And what it did is it then knocked out all those 25.5s from being, quote, underserved or unserved for all this funding. So it is risky, but what's your plan there?
Yeah, so, the Georgia definition is in statute. This would need to be something that would have to go through our assembly and ultimately be signed by the governor. So it's not as easy as just a quick rules change under GTA or under DCA or the Broadband Initiative here in Georgia. So it is a little bit more complicated. The definition that we arrived at minus the satellite and having that terrestrial in there was to try to stay in line with the FCC because we didn't want to make it confusing for providers to have to, say that, well, per FCC, this is served and per Georgia, it is not. So we are going to watch the FCC on this. If the FCC changes their definition, as Chairwoman Rosenworcel has mentioned a couple times that she's interested in, I think we would certainly follow suit pretty quickly behind that. You know, what we would be concerned about if we would do it, if we would go ahead and jump to 120 or something like that already. And we're also keeping this in mind for how we deploy BEAD funds and some of these other ones is if we suddenly change that definition, what we don't want to happen is to have 25.3 locations that don't even have 25.3 get truly left behind forever. Because if we open up funds and we say, hey, unserved in Georgia is anything less than 120, there's a lot of locations that are suddenly going to be eligible, and people and providers, and we understand this. This is, you know, we want to be reasonable here. We want people to be able to do business in Georgia and make a living. That, I mean, they're going to look to upgrading locations that are currently at 25.3 or currently at 50 and 5 that are in more concentrated areas than going after locations that are, you know, at 10 per mile down in really rural Georgia and don't even have 25.3. So we want to be careful of that to make sure that we don't leave people behind forever. But, you know, should the FCC change their definition or should the legislature here in Georgia say, you know what, 25.3 is really not reasonable. That's not served. You know, then I think we would go along with that.
Well, Josh, we got a real easy fix for you. If it's not fiber, it's not broadband. So then you don't ever have to worry about this again. So just do it right.
I like it.
Hey, listen, just one last quick one. Is your maps downloadable for companies to use in their GIS planning systems?
Yes. So what we would say is you have to enter into a sub-license agreement with us and our vendor to just basically say, hey, we're not going to take this data and sell it ourselves and make money off of it. It's courteous that our mapping vendor has allowed us to provide that free of cost if someone should sign a form with us and a license with us. For a private provider, to get that, we would say ideally wait for the state to open up, say, our capital projects grant program later this year. And then if you're looking to apply for that, then you can say, hey, we're wanting to apply and thus we need this data. If you would like it sooner, what we would say is, and this is definitely you know, best practice, I think, and something I would advise here in Georgia is pick up conversations with communities that are showed as unserved on our broadband map as soon as possible. Get talking with them and say, hey, we've got this great product. We can roll this out this quickly. We can really help your citizens. And should you get the support of a community, a city or a county, they can request this data from us at any given time because it is public. We want them to have this. We want them to have communities to have this for their planning, and then to engage with providers in anticipation of grant programs. So two different ways.
Thanks, there. Josh. You know, there's so many great questions here, so hopefully you can follow up offline with on those questions. And you know, we really appreciate all the work that you and your colleagues are doing at GTA. So thank you for your hard work. And also thanks everyone for joining us today. I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to be discussing U.S. business technology analysis, telecom transformation in the new normal with my old friend, Matt Davis, the founder and principal analyst at Independent Research. He's going to share his most recent survey findings that analyze which telecom and IT technologies saw the biggest changes as we entered the new normal. So you're not going to want to miss that. We'll see you guys next Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.